The autumn rain hammered against the windows of the Detroit Public Library's main branch with a relentless intensity that matched the turmoil brewing in Alice Morrison's chest. It was October 1973, and the city felt like a powder keg ready to explode. The aftermath of the Pentagon Papers revelation still echoed through American consciousness, while the Watergate scandal dominated every newspaper headline. Trust in government had never been lower, and paranoia seemed to seep through the very walls of institutions that once felt safe and sacred. Alice had always found solace among the towering shelves of books, their musty scent and orderly arrangement providing a stark contrast to the chaos of the outside world. At 28, she had spent nearly 6 years cataloguing volumes, helping students with research, and maintaining the quiet sanctuary that libraries represented in an increasingly loud and fractured society. Her colleagues often remarked on her methodical nature, the way she could locate any document within minutes, her ability to remember exactly where she had filed each piece of information. It was a skill that would soon prove more valuable than she could have imagined. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon, cutting through the hushed atmosphere like a knife. Alice's younger brother, Thomas, had been missing for 3 days. The voice on the other end belonged to his roommate at Wayne State University, a nervous young man named David who stumbled over his words as he explained how Thomas had simply vanished after attending what he called a meeting with some friends. Alice felt her carefully constructed world begin to tilt. Thomas, 22 and passionate about social justice, had always been the fire to her ice, the one who challenged authority while she quietly observed from the sidelines. Their parents had died in a car accident when Thomas was 16, leaving Alice to raise him through his rebellious teenage years and into his politically awakened college phase. "What kind of meeting?" Alice asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David's pause told her everything she needed to know. Her brother had been involved with anti-war activists, civil rights organizers, and various groups that the FBI had been monitoring under COINTELPRO. Alice had warned him repeatedly about the dangers of such associations, especially after the revelations about government surveillance of activist groups had become public knowledge. But Thomas, idealistic and unafraid, had laughed off her concerns, insisting that someone had to stand up for what was right, even if it meant taking risks. The rain continued to pound the windows as Alice gathered her things, her hands trembling slightly as she locked away the index cards she had been organizing. Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian, approached with concerned eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Alice, dear, is everything all right? You look pale." Alice managed a weak smile, explaining that she needed to take some time off due to a family emergency. The older woman's expression grew grave as she squeezed Alice's shoulder. "These are dangerous times, child. Be careful who you trust, and remember that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones wearing badges." That evening, Alice sat in her small apartment on the east side of Detroit, surrounded by newspapers and trying to make sense of her brother's disappearance. The city outside her window was a study in contrasts. Abandoned factories stood like tombstones to America's industrial past, while new construction projects promised urban renewal. But beneath the surface of progress lurked the tensions that had exploded into the 1967 riots. Tensions that had never fully healed. The relationship between law enforcement and communities remained strained. Trust was a luxury few could afford, and young people like Thomas often found themselves caught between their desire for justice and the harsh realities of a system that viewed dissent as a threat. Alice spread out everything she knew about her brother's recent activities. There were flyers for anti-war demonstrations, copies of underground newspapers with articles about government corruption, and a notebook filled with his passionate scribblings about civil rights and social reform. One entry caught her attention. "Meeting JR tomorrow night. Says he has information about surveillance operations targeting student groups. Could be big." The date was 3 days ago, the night before Thomas disappeared. The apartment felt suffocating as Alice realized the magnitude of what she was facing. This wasn't simply a case of a college student going off on an adventure or losing track of time. The political climate of 1973 America was charged with suspicion and fear. The FBI's COINTELPRO operations had been exposed, revealing years of illegal surveillance, infiltration, and harassment of civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and other dissidents. Students were disappearing, activists were being arrested on trumped-up charges, and families were being torn apart by the machinery of a government that seemed to view its own citizens as potential enemies. As midnight approached, Alice made a decision that would change her life forever. She would not wait for authorities to find her brother, especially when those same authorities might be responsible for his disappearance. She would not accept the bureaucratic runarounds and official denials that she had read about in similar cases. Thomas was her responsibility, her family, her world. If the system had failed him, then she would have to step outside the system to bring him home. The quiet librarian who had spent years organizing other people's stories was about to write the most dangerous chapter of her own life. The rain finally stopped as Alice began to pack a small bag, her mind already working through the methodical approach she would need to take. She had skills that could serve her well in this new reality, an ability to research, to organize information, to remain calm under pressure, and to think logically through complex problems. But she also knew she couldn't do this alone. Finding Thomas would require her to trust people she had never met, to venture into communities she had only read about, and to confront truths about her country that she had always hoped weren't real. The comfortable silence of the library was about to be replaced by the deafening noise of a search that would take her to the very heart of American power and corruption in the turbulent 1970s. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Wayne State University campus as Alice made her way to Thomas's dormitory, her breath visible in the crisp November air. Detroit in 1973 felt like a city holding its breath, caught between the promise of renewal and the reality of decline. The auto industry was beginning to show cracks that would eventually become chasms. Unemployment was rising, and the social tensions that had exploded in the late 1960s continued to simmer just beneath the surface. Alice had never felt more out of place as she navigated the student-filled pathways, her conservative dress and cautious demeanor marking her as an outsider in a world that belonged to her missing brother. David met her at the dormitory entrance, his nervous energy immediately apparent as he chain-smoked cigarettes and glanced repeatedly over his shoulder. "I shouldn't be talking about this," he said, leading her to a secluded bench away from other students. "But Thomas was my friend, and what's happening to people like him isn't right." Alice listened intently as David explained the growing paranoia on campus. Students suspected of radical activities were being followed, their phones tapped, their mail intercepted. Several activists had been arrested on questionable charges, and rumors persisted about infiltrators within various organizations. "Thomas knew he was being watched," David continued. He started varying his routes to class, never used the same payphone twice, and became obsessed with checking for surveillance. The picture David painted of her brother was startling. The passionate but carefree young man Alice remembered had been transformed into someone constantly looking over his shoulder, someone who understood that his idealism had made him a target. "The meeting he went to that night," Alice pressed. "Tell me everything you know." "Nice." David's discomfort was palpable as he explained that Thomas had been contacted by someone claiming to have evidence of FBI infiltration within student organizations. He called himself JR, said he was former military, had a change of heart about what the government was doing to its own people. Thomas was excited about the meeting, thought it could expose the whole surveillance network. Alice felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. Her methodical mind immediately began analyzing the situation. If JR was legitimate, Thomas might have stumbled into something far more dangerous than student activism. If he was a trap, her brother could be in government custody or worse. Either way, she needed to find this mysterious contact, but she had no idea how to navigate the shadowy world where such connections were made. As if reading her thoughts, David mentioned that there was someone who might be able to help, though he warned that approaching this person would be crossing a line from which there might be no return. The address David provided led Alice to a rundown neighborhood on Detroit's southwest side, where the effects of urban decay were evident in abandoned storefronts and houses with boarded windows. The Vietnam Veterans Against the War office occupied a cramped second-floor space above a used bookstore, its walls covered with protest posters and photographs of young men who had seen too much. Alice climbed the narrow stairs, her heart pounding as she realized she was about to enter a world she had only read about in newspapers, a world her government considered dangerous and subversive. Javier Rodriguez looked nothing like what Alice had expected. Sitting behind a battered desk covered with paperwork and coffee-stained documents, he appeared to be in his early 30s, his dark hair already showing traces of grey at the temples. His brown eyes held a weariness that seemed far older than his years, and when he looked up at Alice's entrance, she saw both intelligence and deep sadness reflected there. He was lean and muscular in the way of someone who had learned to stay in fighting shape out of necessity rather than vanity, and there was something about his posture that suggested constant alertness, as if he was always ready for trouble. "You must be Thomas Morrison's sister," Javier said without preamble, his voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of Chicago's Mexican-American neighborhoods. "David called and told me you might be coming by." Alice was surprised by his directness, but also relieved that she wouldn't have to explain her situation from the beginning. Javier gestured for her to sit in a worn chair across from his desk, his manner professional but cautious. "Let me be clear about something right away," he continued. "I help families find missing veterans and activists because I know what it's like to be abandoned by the system you served. But what you're asking me to do is dangerous, not just for your brother, but for all of us." Alice studied the man across from her, trying to read the complex emotions playing across his features. The walls around his desk were covered with photographs and documents that told a story of transformation and disillusionment. There were pictures of him in military uniform, looking proud and young, alongside more recent images of protest marches and vigils for missing veterans. A purple heart sat in a small frame next to letters from families thanking him for his help. This was someone who had traveled from one world to another, from serving his country to questioning everything he had once believed. "I served 2 tours in Vietnam," Javier explained, his voice taking on the flat tone of someone reciting facts he had shared many times before. "Came home in 1971 thinking I had done my duty, that I had fought for freedom and democracy. It didn't take long to realize that the same government that had sent me halfway around the world to fight communism was using similar tactics against its own citizens right here at home." He paused, studying Alice's reaction before continuing. "I've seen what happens to people who ask too many questions, who try to expose uncomfortable truths. Your brother isn't the first idealistic student to disappear after getting too close to something the authorities want to keep hidden." Alice felt a surge of desperation mixed with determination. "Then you'll help me find him?" she asked, her voice stronger than she felt. Javier was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving to the window that looked out over the struggling neighborhood below. "I'll help you," he said finally, "but you need to understand what you're getting into. We're not just looking for a missing person. We're challenging a system that has unlimited resources, no accountability, and a long history of making problems disappear permanently. Are you prepared for that?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Alice realized that this was the moment when her old life would end and something entirely new would begin. She thought about Thomas, about the promises she had made to their parents, about the quiet life she was being asked to abandon. But she also thought about the fear in David's eyes, the weariness in Javier's voice, and the growing understanding that her brother had become caught up in something far bigger than student activism. "Yes," she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "I'm prepared." Javier nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer but hoped he might be wrong. "Then we start tomorrow. But first, you need to understand that from this point forward, you're not just Thomas Morrison's sister. You're someone who has chosen to stand against a system that doesn't like to be challenged. That changes everything, including who you can trust and how you need to live your life." As Alice left the office and walked back to her car through the gathering darkness of the Detroit evening, she felt the weight of that transformation already beginning. The librarian who had walked up those stairs an hour earlier no longer existed. In her place was someone willing to risk everything to find the truth, no matter how dangerous that truth might prove to be. The abandoned warehouse on Detroit's east side stood like a monument to the city's industrial decline, its broken windows and rusted exterior telling the story of economic collapse that had left entire neighborhoods scarred and forgotten. It was here, 3 weeks into their search, that Alice found herself following Javier through a maze of debris and shadows, her transformation from cautious librarian to determined investigator now complete. The November cold bit through her jacket as they approached what appeared to be just another derelict building, but Alice had learned that in this new world she inhabited, nothing was ever quite what it seemed. Javier moved with the practiced stealth of someone who had spent months navigating hostile territory, his footsteps barely audible on the broken concrete. Alice had learned to match his careful movements, to observe before acting, to trust her instincts in ways she never had before. The past weeks had been a crash course in survival and investigation, teaching her skills no library science program had ever covered. She had learned to recognize surveillance, to vary her routines, to communicate through coded messages, and to live with the constant awareness that she was being watched by forces she couldn't see but definitely felt. Their investigation had led them through Detroit's underground network of activists, veterans, and dissidents, a shadow community that existed parallel to mainstream society but remained largely invisible to outsiders. Alice had discovered that her brother had been more deeply involved in this world than she had ever realized. Thomas had been working with a group attempting to document government surveillance of student organizations, collecting testimonies from activists who had been harassed, arrested, or simply disappeared. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered a pattern of systematic intimidation designed to silence dissent and discourage political engagement among young Americans. The breakthrough had come through Maria Santos, a social worker who helped families navigate the bureaucratic maze when loved ones went missing. Maria had connected them with Father Michael O'Brien, a Catholic priest whose parish in southwest Detroit had become an unofficial sanctuary for activists and veterans struggling with the psychological aftermath of their political involvement. Father O'Brien had confirmed their worst fears. Thomas had indeed made contact with someone claiming to be a former intelligence operative willing to provide evidence of illegal government activities, but the meeting had been a trap designed to identify and neutralize potential threats to ongoing operations. "JR is real," Javier had explained as they prepared for tonight's encounter, "but he's not what your brother thought he was." James Richardson was military intelligence, specialized in domestic surveillance and infiltration operations. He did have a change of heart, but not until after he had already done significant damage to people like Thomas. The plan they had developed was dangerous and relied on information provided by Richardson himself, who had agreed to meet them at the warehouse as part of what he claimed was an attempt to atone for his past actions. Inside the warehouse, the temperature seemed even colder, and Alice could see her breath as they made their way toward a section where someone had set up what appeared to be a temporary living space. Cardboard and tarps had been arranged to create a crude shelter, and the smell of instant coffee mixed with cigarette smoke indicated recent habitation. Javier raised his hand, signaling for Alice to stop, and they waited in the shadows until a figure emerged from the makeshift camp. James Richardson looked nothing like Alice had expected. Instead of the clean-cut government operative she had imagined, she saw a man who appeared to have been living rough for months. His clothes were worn and dirty, his hair unkempt, and his eyes held the haunted look of someone carrying unbearable guilt. He was perhaps 40 years old, but stress and exhaustion made him appear much older. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat accent of the rural Midwest, and his hands shook slightly as he lit another cigarette from the stub of his previous one. "I've been hiding in places like this since I walked away from the operation 6 months ago," Richardson began, his words coming in nervous bursts punctuated by long drags on his cigarette. "Your brother stumbled into something much bigger than student surveillance. The program I was part of wasn't just watching activists. We were actively disrupting their organizations, creating internal conflicts, and when necessary, removing key individuals who posed significant threats to ongoing operations." Alice felt her stomach tighten as Richardson confirmed what she had begun to suspect, but hoped wasn't true. Richardson explained that he had been tasked with infiltrating various anti-war and civil rights groups throughout the Midwest, using his military background and apparent disillusionment to gain trust within activist communities. "The operation was sophisticated," he continued, involving multiple agencies and years of planning. We had files on thousands of students, detailed psychological profiles, information about their families, their weaknesses, their fears. Thomas had become a person of interest because of his ability to organize and inspire others, but also because his research was getting too close to exposing the full scope of what we were doing. The most devastating revelation came when Richardson described the night Thomas disappeared. "I was ordered to make contact and arrange a meeting, supposedly to provide him with evidence of surveillance activities. The plan was to determine exactly what he knew and who he had shared information with, then eliminate him as a threat to ongoing operations." Richardson's voice broke as he continued. "I went through with the initial contact, but when I saw how young he was, how genuinely committed to justice, I couldn't follow through with the rest. I warned him that the meeting was a trap, told him to run and hide, but it was too late. Other operatives were already in position." Alice felt the world spinning around her as she processed this information. Her brother hadn't disappeared randomly or been arrested through normal channels. He had been specifically targeted by a coordinated operation designed to neutralize threats to government activities that themselves were illegal and unconstitutional. "Where is he now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richardson's expression grew even more pained as he stubbed out his cigarette and reached for another. "That's what I've been trying to find out," he replied. "There are several facilities where people like Thomas are taken, places that don't officially exist, and where normal legal protections don't apply. Some are temporary holding locations where subjects are interrogated and processed. Others are longer-term facilities where individuals who can't be released without compromising operations are held indefinitely." The implications of what he was describing hit Alice like a physical blow. Her brother wasn't just missing. He was being held prisoner by his own government for the crime of believing in democracy and justice. Javier, who had remained silent throughout most of Richardson's confession, finally spoke. "You're telling us that American citizens are being disappeared and held without due process by their own government?" Richardson nodded miserably. "It's been happening for years, but the scale has increased dramatically since the Pentagon Papers and Watergate. The administration is paranoid about internal threats and willing to use any means necessary to protect what they see as national security interests." Alice felt something fundamental shift inside her as she absorbed the full horror of what Richardson was describing. The country she had grown up believing in, the institutions she had trusted, the system of laws and rights she had taken for granted. All of it was an illusion maintained for the benefit of those who had never questioned authority. Her brother had asked the wrong questions and had paid the price. But she was beginning to understand that his disappearance was part of a much larger pattern of oppression and control that threatened everyone who dared to think independently. As Richardson provided them with locations and contact information that might help them continue their search, Alice realized that finding Thomas was no longer just about rescuing her brother. It had become about exposing a system of oppression that was fundamentally incompatible with the values America claimed to represent. The quiet librarian who had entered this warehouse was gone forever, replaced by someone willing to fight a war she had never wanted to acknowledge was being waged against people like her brother. People like herself, people who believed that democracy meant more than just casting votes in elections that might themselves be meaningless. The safe house in suburban Cleveland represented everything Alice had never expected to find herself part of, a network of resistance operating in the shadows of American society, sustained by people who had discovered that their government viewed them as enemies rather than citizens. The modest ranch house on Maple Street looked exactly like every other home in the neighborhood, complete with a carefully maintained lawn and holiday decorations that suggested nothing more dangerous than a typical middle-class family preparing for Christmas, 1973. But inside, the basement had been converted into a communication center where former intelligence operatives, disillusioned veterans, and committed activists coordinated efforts to document and expose the systematic violation of civil liberties being carried out in democracy's name. It had been 2 months since Alice and Javier began their search for Thomas, 2 months that had transformed both of them in ways they could never have anticipated. Alice's methodical approach to research had proven invaluable in tracking down leads, connecting seemingly unrelated pieces of information, and organizing the growing body of evidence they had accumulated about illegal government operations. Her background as a librarian had given her skills perfectly suited to underground intelligence work, and she had discovered abilities within herself that years of quiet routine had never revealed. Javier, meanwhile, had found in their partnership something he hadn't experienced since leaving the military, a sense of purpose that transcended personal survival and connected to something larger than himself. The breakthrough they had been hoping for came through Sarah Kovac, a former State Department analyst who had resigned in protest after discovering the scope of domestic surveillance operations. Sarah had maintained contacts within the intelligence community, and through careful cultivation of these relationships, she had been able to confirm Thomas's location and current status. "He's being held at a facility in rural Pennsylvania," Sarah explained, her voice tight with anger and frustration. "It's officially a federal research installation, but it's actually a black site where people who can't be processed through normal legal channels are held for extended interrogation and psychological evaluation." The news was both a relief and a new source of terror for Alice. Thomas was alive, but he had been in government custody for over 2 months, subjected to interrogation techniques that Richardson had described as designed to break down psychological resistance and extract information about activist networks. "The program is called cognitive restructuring," Sarah continued, "and it's based on techniques developed for military prisoners of war. The goal isn't just to get information, it's to fundamentally alter the subject's worldview and eliminate their potential to inspire or organize others in the future." Alice felt sick as she processed the implications of what Sarah was describing. Her brother wasn't just being held prisoner, he was being systematically broken down and rebuilt to eliminate the very qualities that made him who he was. His passion for justice, his ability to inspire others, his fundamental belief in human dignity and democratic values, all of it was being targeted for destruction by professionals who had turned psychological manipulation into a science. "How long can someone survive that kind of treatment?" Alice asked, dreading the answer. Javier answered before Sarah could respond, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "I've seen what extended psychological pressure can do to strong people," he said quietly. "The human mind can endure incredible trauma, but it can also be permanently damaged by sustained assault on core beliefs and identity. Every day Thomas remains in that facility, he becomes less likely to fully recover, even if we manage to get him out." The urgency of the situation was clear, but so was the magnitude of the challenge they faced. The facility where Thomas was being held was essentially a small fortress, protected by multiple layers of security and staffed by personnel who had no accountability to civilian oversight or normal legal processes. Any attempt to rescue him would require resources and coordination far beyond what their small group could provide, and the risks of exposure were enormous. Even if they succeeded in getting Thomas out, they would all become fugitives from a government that had already demonstrated its willingness to disappear inconvenient citizens. Sarah had a proposal that was both their best hope and most dangerous option. "There's a congressional aide named Jennifer Walsh who's been quietly investigating reports of missing activists and illegal detention," she explained. "She has access to classified information and the potential to expose this entire program, but she needs evidence that can't be dismissed or covered up. If we can document Thomas's case thoroughly enough, if we can provide proof that American citizens are being held without due process and subjected to psychological torture, it might force congressional action." The plan they developed over the following days was complex and required everyone to take enormous personal risks. Alice would return to Detroit and continue her normal routine while secretly gathering documentary evidence about Thomas's disappearance and the broader pattern of surveillance and detention. Javier would work with his veteran networks to identify other missing activists and build a comprehensive database of cases. Richardson, despite the danger to himself, would reach out to former colleagues who might be willing to provide inside information about the program's scope and operations. Meanwhile, Sarah would establish contact with Congressman Walsh and begin preparing for eventual testimony that could expose the entire operation. The timeline was critical because they had learned that subjects in the cognitive restructuring program were typically held for 6 to 12 months before being either released with severely damaged psychological states or transferred to long-term facilities where they disappeared permanently. Thomas had already been in custody for 2 months, giving them a narrow window to act before it became too late to save him. As Alice prepared to return to Detroit and resume her cover as a grieving sister seeking her missing brother through official channels, she reflected on how completely her life had been transformed. The quiet librarian who had answered that first phone call about Thomas's disappearance no longer existed, replaced by someone who understood that the comfortable illusions of American democracy were luxuries available only to those who never questioned the system or challenged its authority. She had learned that her government was capable of unspeakable violations of human rights, that institutions she had trusted were willing to destroy lives to protect their own power, and that ordinary citizens who stood up for justice could disappear without a trace. But Alice had also discovered something else. She was not alone in her understanding of these truths, and there were others willing to risk everything to fight back against oppression. The network of resistance she had become part of represented the best of American values, even as it operated outside American law. These were people who refused to accept that democracy was a facade, who insisted that the principles of human dignity and justice were worth defending even against their own government. The drive back to Detroit took place through a winter landscape that seemed to mirror Alice's internal state, stark, cold, but somehow beautiful in its harsh honesty. Snow covered the abandoned factories and empty lots that marked the decline of American industrial power. But it also covered the new growth that was slowly emerging in unexpected places. Change was coming, whether those in power welcomed it or not, and Alice was determined to be part of that transformation, no matter what it cost her personally. As she pulled into the parking lot of the Detroit Public Library, where her old life waited to resume, Alice thought about Thomas and the thousands of other young Americans who had believed in their country enough to demand that it live up to its highest ideals. They had been betrayed by those they trusted, victimized by those sworn to protect them, and abandoned by systems that claimed to serve justice. But their vision of what America could become was not dead, and neither was the fight to make that vision real. The search for Thomas had become something much larger, a search for the soul of American democracy itself, and Alice was no longer willing to accept that such a search was beyond the power of ordinary citizens, willing to risk everything for the truth.